do think the best opportunities right now are around the picks and shovels, the infrastructure of AI, especially the computing infrastructure needed to process huge amounts of data and deploy, potentially massive models and have them work with very limited latency is where there's a ton of opportunity.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing amazing conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor and an advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI or looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact, Amish Devatia, CEO of Baffle, writes in The Hill Online that we must regulate AI now or suffer catastrophic consequences later. Amish references OpenAI's Sam Altman, who recently asked legislators to regulate his own company. Noting the uniqueness of a tech leader recommending tech regulation, he writes, for Congress to address harmful flaws in generative AI platforms, it must gather insight from a diverse set of constituents who understand issues such as bias and abuse prevention, data accuracy, data privacy, and data transparency. Amish echoes a popular opinion in Silicon Valley that regulation is good. He chooses not to address the more difficult topics about who should own regulatory frameworks, and more importantly, how they should be enforced. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. But now shifting to this week's conversation. Entrepreneurs tend to wonder what it's like to be a VC. And VCs, without an operating background, often don't understand the grit required to turn an idea into a successful business. The best investors I've ever met have been successful operators first. Today's guest is one of those. Nick Adams founded Differential Ventures in 2017 to invest in B2B, data-first seed stage companies. Since then, Nick and the team have invested in an impressive group of companies, including Private AI, Ocrolus, and Agnostic. Before Differential, Nick helped grow companies like OPower and RAGE Frameworks in sales, marketing, and product leadership roles. Today, we get to learn about how to innovate and grow a startup when that product is a venture fund. Without further ado, Nick, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Dan. Good to be here. So my career and journey into venture, like most people, was not super linear, was not scripted from the beginning. And in my case, actually started as a washed up athlete coming out of college and a failed career in law. So played baseball at Brandeis up in Boston, went to undergrad as a history and legal studies major, worked in a law firm, during my free time, all during college, and started there full time. Was going to do the 2 years of working in the law firm, save a little money, go to law school thing. And about 4 months in, I had that real, I believe the technical term is oh shit moment of like, I was not in the right place. I could not see myself spending the rest of my career in law. So long story short, did some networking, mercifully was hired into a Series A tech company in Boston called 170 Systems back in about 2004. Was a great launch into startup world and where I first learned about venture and kicked off close to a 15-year career for me on the tech side of things where, as you mentioned, I ran product management, sales, marketing. I'd probably be what today we'd call a growth leader. And had some really cool experiences from opening the first US office for a European company that was publicly traded in Finland to being part of OPower and the rocket ship that went public in 2014 in the energy efficiency space. And then being a bit of a pioneer in the natural language processing world, launching a solution for RAGE frameworks that analyze structured and unstructured data for analyzing risk. And along the way, I went back to school a couple of times so I could learn the finance side of business. I already had the law side, was learning to sell and build a product. And the second time I went back, I was going to school in Hong Kong. And, kind of day one introductions in school as a 35-year-old guy. I said, I'm Nick, I work in the tech world. I'm thinking about moving into venture. One of my classmates had a twin brother who was also an alumni of the program and said he could introduce me to a fund in New York. That fund was Differential Ventures. I started about 3 weeks later with Laurel Toby as a venture partner and had a really good run there. But I knew I really wanted to focus on building a fund that was really a culmination of my experiences as an entrepreneur, and build the next generation or back the next generation of enterprise tech companies I felt would be largely data oriented and data focused. So that was the journey. I always say, Differential today is a culmination of my experience as kind of a product manager and growth leader, and my partner David, who's a very deep tech resource in computer science and natural language processing, and spent 22 years building the algorithms behind Renaissance Technologies that had probably the most successful quantitative hedge fund of all time. And that's what we're doing today. We're still seed investors in the AI space, and looking for great founders that are building enterprise solutions to make companies actually data driven, not just in the marketing collateral.
We've had some amazing investors on this podcast. Ashu Garg is one that comes to mind from Foundation, and many others who have talked about the grit and the hustle required to be a good investor. I think it's something that few entrepreneurs appreciate. Talk us through some of maybe the less glamorous aspects of the role of an investor and how that relates to what you learned as an operator.
Yeah, I always say that for me, going from the operational side to being an investor was a natural, comfortable shift for me. I'd led a bunch of teams. I always enjoyed being in the background, helping my team members get better. And I feel like a lot of that is similar to being an investor. Now, the reality is going from being an investor who works on part of a team to a fund manager who is responsible for the overall success of the portfolio is probably something I underestimated a bit in the beginning. I knew I wanted to be good at it and didn't realize how much that was going to take to just be, nobody really talks about the fun, exciting part of fund administration and portfolio construction and just the work that goes into making sure your LPs are communicated with properly, get all the proper reporting, compliance, and governance stuff in place on an ongoing basis. And it takes up a fair chunk of my time. I try and, surround myself with people better than me in each of those areas to make sure, we get the best people working on things and I can oversee most of it. And also try and take most of it on so that, my partners and the rest of our team don't need to spend much time worrying about those things. But it's definitely not the most glamorous part. I think the other part of venture that's hard and complicated, beyond a lot of the difficult conversations you have with founders, is just managing careers and growth trajectories for associates and the junior employees in any fund. There's just a natural friction between really smart, ambitious people who want to grow their careers and what needs to be done in any given firm. And I find it's hard to come in and grow from kind of an analyst or an associate level up through partner, like you kind of see in the legal world or in accounting or places where you have a more defined trajectory from entry level job to a partner. So those are a couple I find to be not so glamorous, have some inherent friction built into them and things that I'm constantly looking for better solutions for, so that I can spend time on more of my time on the fun stuff, which is working with our founders and out there looking for our next great investment.
I'm sure, like most investors, yours is a very inverted pyramid in terms of a ton of pitches that you hear at the top of the funnel, ultimately culminating in probably just a few checks a year that you end up writing into new companies. I'm sure you hear some wild and ambitious pitches and you meet some great entrepreneurs. Would love for the listeners to know, what's the most memorable pitch you've heard, whether or not you invested in a company?
There's been a ton. I mean, one that just sticks out was a path and a very, serious financial projection from 0 to $100 billion in revenue in year one, which was remarkable. I said I'd be really impressed if you could pull this off for sure. I'll tell this story, even though it's like PG-13. But was on a pitch meeting with a company. It was on Zoom, kind of during the early days of COVID. And it was actually like a second or third meeting. We really liked what this company was doing. They were, doing some image compression, video compression work to make websites, run faster, load faster. And during the presentation, I had our 19-year-old intern and a couple of our associates on the call with us. And the founder flipped and shared his screen, his browser, and there were like 8 tabs of porn sites up and loaded on there. And I didn't quite catch it at first. I was sort of in my own head doing my own thing, but I happened to catch the face of our 19-year-old intern, and it just like dropped, and I saw him staring. And for whatever reason, in the back of my mind, I said, I know what just happened here without even seeing it directly. And then when I looked, I was like, yep, I'm right. So to this day, I'm still not sure if this was related to the work they were doing in terms of image compression and making sites load faster, or if this was just caught the guy in a bad moment and he shared a screen he shouldn't have. So that one, I must say, will always stick in there for various reasons. And to hedge the next question, we did not invest in the company.
Nick, I've asked that question a number of times, and I got to say, that's the most memorable answer ever. Unbelievable.
There you go. You're welcome.
All right. So the flip side of that question. So every investor's got an anti-portfolio. The company they could have invested in and ended up not and regretting it. What's top of your anti-portfolio?
I try not to do that too much. I'll give you one, and I especially trying to do it over the last few years, because I think there were especially at the seed stage, there were so many companies that raised so much money so quickly that you could have this, sense that you may have missed something that was just going like crazy based on how much they had raised, but not necessarily, their growth or their revenue traction or whatever else. And as seed investors, that matters, right? The amount of capital raised into a company makes a big impact on our ownership when they ultimately exit, because we can't write the huge follow-on checks to maintain a 10 or 15 or even a 5% ownership stake sometimes. So I'll give the one that it ate at me for a while, was a company up in Vancouver actually called Dually. And it was just one of those things where it just made total sense to me. They are a sales automation tool. In the shortest form, they use some NLP to extract data from conversations like this, auto-populate Salesforce and HubSpot. And as an entrepreneur with enough of an AI background or data background to understand it, I thought it was pretty cool. Not rocket science, but very cool application of NLP. And then just as a washed up sales manager and salesperson at some time, the worst thing you can do is not update your CRM system with data. And also the thing you like doing absolute least is updating the CRM with data. So to think about automating that, and then also being able to use that data to then proactively support you during during future conversations hurt me. And we ended up passing on it for some just defensibility reasons and just where they were in terms of their traction at the time. But I sat on it for a while, and it was like one of those things for a couple months, I thought maybe I should have pushed this harder and tried to get it done and get our heads around it and get to a yes. And then they raised like $80 million right after that. So I sat on that one for a little while. And time will tell. I wish those guys nothing but success. But $80 million raised on top of where they were revenue wise during that market, I think is probably a tough one to grow into. And who knows? These are long games. We'll find out if it was really a miss or not in probably 8 to 10 years.
Like you said, you don't lick your wounds, because who knows? The check that you could have written into Dually, who knows what you invested in instead. And when that becomes a rocket ride, you pat yourself on the back.
You're right. I always say, despite all of my kind of professional career and academic career and things I've learned along the way, I think the thing that prepared me most for being a venture capital investor was actually being a baseball player, because baseball is like it's a mentally abusive sport based on failure. Nowhere else do you fail 70% of the time at what you do, and you're one of the best players in the league, right? So in baseball, we always say you have a very short memory. If you, I hate to use sports analogies, but this is just a true sports story reality. But in baseball, like if you're 4 for 4 in a game and you get up and you strike out with the bases loaded and you lose, nobody cares about your 4 for 4. You're a zero. But if you're 0 for 4 and you get up and you hit a home run to win the game, everybody forgets the 0 for 4. You're a hero that day. So you have to have a very short memory one way or another, whether you've been, your last outcome was great or your last outcome was horrible. You just have to move on and go for the next one. So I think it's, as an investor, probably one of my greatest strengths and biggest flaws, because there are definitely times where I could, sit back and reflect a little bit more on why we did or didn't do something. So, I tend to think about more if I feel good about the process and we went through the right steps and got to the decision, yes or no, that we think is right for our firm, then I'm comfortable with that outcome, regardless of what the company ends up doing in the long term.
Good friend of the podcast is a guy named Dan Grunfeld, who was a legendary shooting guard at Stanford. His dad, Ernie, owned the Bucks, and we had a similar discussion on this podcast. And Dan said the single best thing that prepared him to be an investor at Lightspeed was, the 5 a.m., morning workouts, shooting hoops, perfecting his jump shot, but hours before anyone was awake, kind of like the way Kobe used to talk about the art. And so that resonates. I mean, your 4 for 4 example, absolutely.
It's spot on. It's kind of like, what do you do when nobody else is looking? I used to have a weird habit when I was in the sales world of right after we closed an important deal, I would make 10 cold calls or send 10 cold emails just to make sure I was, building the top of the funnel. You felt good. You're kind of riding on a high at the moment. I felt like I always had sort of my best game right after closing a big deal. So I just start doing the grunt work that you kind of hate anyway as you progress in your career. And I feel like, that's like the 5 a.m. Shooting free throws in the gym. Just what are you doing? Everybody else is doing something else.
So true in life as in sales. You're only as good as the last deal you closed. Right? Good. Well, we are in the middle of what I'll call maybe a twice a decade technology hype cycle. That being generative AI. It feels eerily similar to hype cycles, whether it was Web3, climate tech, cloud, you can go on, mobile, etc. Is this cycle different? And if it's different, where are there opportunities for entrepreneurs to innovate, given just the crush of new ideas and new companies being formed related to generative AI?
My sense is this, and I say this with the humility and having been humbled, I think, that I really don't understand OpenAI still today. And I say that meaning I understand generative AI, I understand, foundation models. What it means to build an AI model, an AI solution on 100 trillion parameters, it's still hard for my brain to fully comprehend. So while I'm wildly impressed by a lot of things that have happened and they've been able to accomplish with these large language models, I'm still skeptical that this follows some familiar paths, like you said, Dan, of some of these generative models may have been overtrained for the most likely early scenarios, early questions that will be asked of these tools. I may be right or wrong, but that's my sense right now. So from my perspective, I still think the most value in AI will come from homegrown, human-labeled models for the most part, solving very specific, important use cases. What I do think generative AI has done is created a massive awareness and a consumer application of AI that anybody can play with and get a feel for it and just raise the awareness of AI and the power of it. And I actually do think it's done a great job of opening up budgets and getting companies to think about what is their AI strategy and what do they need to put in place to make it a reality, because I think that's been lacking and slower to develop, in a lot of the infrastructure and more, people say picks and shovels, but the kind of boring parts of technology that need to be in place for AI to work successfully. So coming back to your original question, is that I do think the best opportunities right now are around the picks and shovels, the infrastructure of AI, especially the computing infrastructure needed to process huge amounts of data and deploy, potentially massive models and have them work with very limited latency, is where there's a ton of opportunity. It's just so prohibitively expensive to do this at scale today, that I think the incumbents, the large companies, have a bit of a moat because they can afford to train models that might cost $5 or $10 million to get up and running. And then, I think from there, they can pay for some of the high performance computing technology that's available to solve some of these questions. But I do think there's still just infrastructure, machine learning operations that need to be in place, a bunch of security, privacy, monitoring, and just governance tools that need to be implemented, and then the infrastructure of how do we actually process this data with these huge models quickly, efficiently. So probably not the most sexy of answers, but I think it's kind of underground plumbing to make AI work the way it needs to. And I think that goes way beyond, trust and responsibility. It's just business sense. You have to understand how your models work, how you get them to production quickly. I think of each new model as a new product. The faster and cheaper you can get a new model into production is like getting it. How fast can you get a new product into the market? And I think that's key. And then beyond that, I think I'm excited to see what can be discovered from these huge models from either small data sets or massive historical data sets that haven't maybe been fully evaluated and analyzed to the level a large language model can do, and see what new information we can find from those. So I'm excited about that part. Mostly all comes back to the data for me.
My in the trenches view, building LLM first apps for the enterprise, is that I'm in violent agreement with you. I think most entrepreneurs and maybe even architects at large enterprises don't appreciate that we are absolutely like in the Paleolithic era in terms of just the readiness of the infrastructure to be able to serve these models at scale. It's, the instrumentation just isn't there. So that's my investment thesis as well, is that there's a Cisco that's going to be born for generative AI. It's the routers and switches. It's keeping the lights on. It's just at a very kind of low level on the hierarchy of needs that we got to get to. So I'm going to guess that every one of your portfolio CEOs in their monthly updates, they're talking about their approach to generative AI, their perspective, their roadmap, et cetera. Maybe if you could pick one, and what do you think is an interesting or innovative use of generative AI that you feel like is adding value?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested. I hate to say this because we have portfolio companies here, but I do think a lot of like the improving marketing material and writing emails and helping with my essay and whatever else is great, super applicable stuff. As a seed investor, I just there's not much I can do there. That ship has sailed for us. So believe it or not, from our perspective, we've gone into some of the areas where I never really wanted to go before from a go-to-market strategy perspective, and that is into some of these laggard technology adoption laggards, manufacturing or government in some cases. And I actually think now is a much better time for this. And the United States passed the CHIPS Act last year, $250 billion going towards things like quantum computing and AI and other critical infrastructure. And the reality is there's very much an arms race going on right now between the US and China, and to some extent Russia and others, to lead the world in AI innovation and semiconductors. And I think it's an important thing to track from a macro perspective. So I'll give an example. One company we invested in is a company called Circuit Mind, and they're using AI to basically automate the schematic approach for electrical engineers. So as you think about designing a prototype for an electrical engineering layout for some device, you have a bunch of different components that need to work together to ultimately create the device that you're designing. This has largely been done by electrical engineers, which is largely an aging demographic of the workforce. Hasn't been the sleekest, sexiest, newest area of technology to get involved in over the last couple of decades, and we have a significant need to design new components and new devices quickly, efficiently, scalably, with an aging workforce. And that's been scary to me from a just technology perspective and from even a national security perspective. So the ability to just use AI to automate the design and layout of these various components that work together and be able to assign different outcomes, desired outcomes to that design, whether you want to optimize for cost or energy efficiency or performance are kind of three most common examples. You can have different layouts automated and presented to the end user to then go in and still do what electrical engineers are really good at, which is tweak and optimize for a particular environment and actually get it ready for procurement. And to me, I think that's super interesting, a great use case of generative AI. Largely, I'm probably pitching my own book here a little too much, but largely more on kind of that homegrown, human labeled, human generated models versus a true foundation model. But I do think they could get to a point where other foundation models are part of that. But I do think it's a cool and important use case for generative AI.
This question is almost unfair. It takes a little bit to unpack, but I'd love to get your perspective on it. The early winners in generative AI, at least if you look at the NASDAQ, are kind of the big seven that represent almost all the gains for the year, starting with, of course, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, et cetera, that own the data. And they've been first to market. They have big R&D teams, big labs, but it's an open question. Let's say in 5 years, does big tech own generative AI, or is there an opportunity, whether it's not, you couldn't exactly call OpenAI a dark horse, but just this explosion of new companies doing interesting Gen AI things? Is there room to disrupt big tech?
Absolutely. You opened with a quote and the discussion around regulation around AI, right? And if I'm being cynical, and that's sort of my job sometimes, I think the only scenario in which the large companies are still in a dominant position for generative AI, let's say in the next 3 to 5 years, is if they are successful in over-regulating AI to the point where only the big companies can afford to get their way through the regulatory process. And I think what we're seeing right now, and I have been fortunate enough to work with the NVCA, the National Venture Capital Association, and Congress directly to put forth the voice of the startup community and the venture capital community. But we know that Facebook, Google, and Microsoft and everybody else has a lot of people walking the halls of Capitol Hill, making their argument that AI needs to be regulated. Arguments coming directly from OpenAI saying that we need to regulate it, that AI is going to take over the world and have a catastrophic outcome. From what I know about AI and what you can see where things are today, that is so far from reality and even being close to a possibility that I think the incentive is to build a regulatory moat around what they have built, which is super impressive. Don't get me wrong, but make sure that nobody else can afford to get through that regulatory process and compete with them. So that's my sense. I think if we can successfully put in place the right guardrails, because I do think that we need to regulate quote unquote AI, but if we can get a proper data privacy, data security policy in place that is, like GDPR, but building upon some of its shortcomings across the U.S. and understand what those rules are, what data can be used, and how. And then I think we can largely regulate bad actors of AI within most of our existing regulatory bodies. I mean, the FDA, the FTC, the CFPB cover an awful lot of the use cases and problems that could arise from bad actors using AI for malicious purposes today. With a few tweaks and so forth. From there, we can then find the 1 or 2% of super outlier use cases that are like specifically AI related, and figure out how to govern and regulate those. So I think that's where we will get to. I'm optimistic that Congress will put the right infrastructure in place to make sure there is adequate competition and not stifle the startups. But I'm concerned about it. I do worry that most of this value could accrue to the big companies if they're successful in lobbying the way that I think they're trying to. So that's my cynical view, and we'll see how it plays out.
There's a small but growing chorus of cynics that in the tech community that believe like you do. When Sam Altman goes on Capitol Hill and lobbies for regulation of OpenAI, it is self-serving, because if OpenAI can put its foot on the proverbial scale, influence how it will be regulated, then obviously that's actually creating a moat for companies like OpenAI. Now, one of the kind of meta themes about generative AI company formation or AI first company formation is that the technology makes it a lot less expensive to bring to market a product. Would you say, is there any indications of that in the nascent stages? You're seeing really early stage companies, that companies maybe like VC will get right sized. Like we'll go back to an era where seed is seed and A is A, rather than everything seeming to shift right. Are you seeing any indications of those trends happening because it's cheaper to take product to market?
I do think that will be true in many cases. So almost like going to the cloud from on-prem software, we saw a reduction of costs and what it takes to start a startup. I think that the use of AI and building products on top of some of these foundation models will help get to the first versions, the MVP of certain products that will work really well on a more or less off the shelf or even open source foundation model that's good enough to get traction. And if you can overfit your models a bit enough in the early days, there will be a lot of companies that go really fast, from 0 to 2 million or 0 to 10 million, because they've hit a use case that they can optimize an off-the-shelf product for enough to get that level of traction. I will be honest with you, and sometimes this is hard to do as a fund, as a thesis. We, even prior to the explosion of generative AI and the availability of OpenAI and others, we've tried to avoid those types of products that we felt couldn't scale meaningfully beyond their initial use cases, because it's just really hard to build a long-term successful company. We understand they will hit a ceiling at some point with what they've built. And as a seed investor, again, we're always trying to figure out, does your initial product get you to $200,000 in revenue, $2 million in revenue, or $200 million in revenue? And at what point? Every company is going to have to diversify their offerings at some point. We're trying to figure out how far an initial product takes you. And we generally look for good, solid foundation of data science, machine learning, and AI technology that can get to not just that first step, but start to think and have the ability to scale beyond your initial product and use case. So if I break it down in briefly, I think yes, will help cut corners for a lot of use cases. Will seem like a super powerful, amazing tool that's going to have to be continually fine-tuned and what I fear is overfit over time to make this one use case really work to the level it needs to over time. And I think the other thing that will be helpful is just, I think a lot of what founders need, especially first-time founders, is they just don't know what they don't know. And I do think that foundation models, large language models can be a very good research tool to just ask questions and get some response as to like, what are go-to-market strategies for an enterprise technology company? How do I find my first sales hire? What are the metrics for a Series B in venture capital, right? I think just getting some information back, whether it's right or wrong, is super useful and will help a lot of newer, less experienced founders scale faster if they know how to use the technology properly. And frankly, that's a lot of what I do as a VC is just help newer founders expect their blind spots, in the future, and try and anticipate when we're going to hit certain barriers, because not every company is the same, not every founder is the same. But a lot of the issues are the same, and you can kind of predict when they're going to happen, and you try and get out ahead of those as much as you can. And I'm hoping that, as much as I think I'm good at that as an investor, and I think a lot of my peers are, especially those who have been in startup roles before, I think this will help to spread that out a little bit more and democratize into the hands of founders even more so than relying on their VCs or mentors or others to help with it. So that's the two areas where I think it'll be most helpful.
Nick, I got to get you off the hot seat, but I'm not letting you go without answering one last question for me. Pick one company that you invested in and tell us a story. Why were you just blown away? Maybe one where just from the first meeting you said, we got to be in this one. What was different about that one?
Trying to decide if I should cheat and give like a super successful one or just give you a brand new one. I'll give you a brand new one. It'd be easy for me to talk about Ocrolus and how great they were and how much they blew me away in the early days, because I had very familiar experience with what they were doing. I'm going to pick a new company, an investment we just made that's public-ish. So we just invested in a company called Metafold up in Toronto. And the founders are really geniuses in the not so widely known space of computational geometry. And what they've done is use a complex geometric algorithm to enable really the full value of additive manufacturing, which we commonly call 3D printing. So 3D printers are capable of cutting products, the items down to a very granular level, super high resolution. But the CAD systems that they're designed on are not. They're still like 256 by 256. So in short, what Metafold has done is implement technology in between the CAD and the 3D printer to enable super granular designs that weren't previously possible. And the thing I love about it is it just unlocks all these use cases, where they're seeing a lot of traction now is in fashion as a starting point, because getting the next awesome shoe or bag or whatever other kind of high-end item out to market has enormous value to them. If they can actually produce more interesting designs faster and less expensive with less waste of product, it's like an all-around win for these guys. But also will be used in areas with enormous value like healthcare and medical devices, defense and aerospace. So I'm super excited. It's a very new investment. We're just in the early days of working with this team, but blown away what they can do, and just love the value that unlocks between the existing status quo software and hardware. So I'll pick those guys for today because I'm excited about them.
We'll link to Metafold in the show notes. That's a great example. Well, Nick, this has been a lot of fun, but where can the audience learn more about you and the work of Differential?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is fine, although it's extraordinarily hard to manage messages in there. If anybody finds a good way to do that, I'd pay for that tomorrow. But LinkedIn's fine. I'm just Nick Adams from Differential VC. My email is nick@differential.vc, and our website is differential.vc. Those are best places to find out about us, and hopefully we're pretty explicit about what we invest in and how. always good to hear from new founders. So please feel free to reach out.
Great discussion, Nick. Thanks for hanging out.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Well, that's a wrap for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from PeopleRain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.